Hi there. I'd like to talk to you about evolution and creationism. So, this is a belief that I've actually held for a very long time. And I'm going to stay away from intelligent design because intelligent design can be used to apply to a creator, a deity, a god, or even a pantheon, or it can be used to apply to, say, scientists or aliens. So I'm not going to address that one because that one's kind of a hot mess. And I really can't, with the variety of possible creators in that context, I really can't defend it. So let's start by talking about evolution. What is evolution? In short, evolution is the change in the heritable characteristics of biological populations over successive generations. It occurs when evolutionary processes such as genetic drift and natural selection act on genetic variation, resulting in certain characteristics becoming more or less common within a population over successive generations. So this process of evolution has given rise to biodiversity at every level of biological organization. And this is the basic theory. Well, it's not a basic theory. This is the theory that underpins a lot of parts of biology. And again, this is a theory. It's not an axiom or even just a law. It is a theory. Theories that are this all encompassing are very hard to prove or disprove for that matter. But unlike claims of my God is real, your God is fake kind of thing, this is a claim that can be explored and proven or disproven eventually. Whereas when you look at religious claims, often the only proof is written in a book. So that makes that claim neither provable nor unprovable because there's no way to get evidence unless God comes down from on high or from wherever God is and makes their presence known to everybody. And it can't be a deep fake and it can't be a holographic projection. It can't be any kind of an AI thing or whatever. And we're getting to the stage where it will soon become very difficult to tell the reality we have from these things that can be made by computers. And I warned about that starting in 2023. Um, so let's get back to this. What is genetic drift? That is where, because of changes in the genes, such as mutations caused by gamma rays, the DNA that creatures have is altered at some level, and some of those changes cause that particular creature with that change to die out. Some of them cause that creature to thrive and become dominant. Some of them cause no useful or deleterious changes to the creature. So they will actually keep that change until such a time as it's either good or bad. And if it's bad, then they'll die out. And if it's good, then they will become dominant. So sometimes a genetic change can happen way back in time, but it'll take a long time for there to be a niche or a change in the environment that will cause that gene, that change, to become important. So you can have something lying dormant for a very long time. And in fact, there are these kinds of changes in humans. Like we've got a tailbone, but we don't have a tail. Um, why don't we get rid of it? I mean, because there's no evolutionary, there's no environmental pressure for us to get rid of it. It doesn't impact us in a positive way or a negative way. It's neutral, therefore it remains. So what about natural selection? Well, natural selection is the influence that I'm talking about. It is, so for example, something that I learned when I was in school about 1,000,000 years ago, yes, I'm a dinosaur, is that if you have a creature living in an environment that is a prey creature, and it has an appearance that happens to mimic what it will typically rest on, and then for some reason that surface becomes changed to a large degree, to the point that there are very few places where you can find, or where that creature can find it. So it's very hard for them to rest, because they don't know where it is, if it still exists. So like in Chernobyl, I'll start with an old example. An old example was, there was a particular kind of moth, and that moth was, I believe it was a very dark moth. And then something happened in the area that it lived in, because it would rest on trees and things that were dark. Something happened whereby these places that it kind of blended in with, that was camouflage, effectively, they were gone from the environment, or drastically reduced, to the point that over time, other moths from the same species were born, but as had always happened, that did not have the matching color, which had a different color to one degree or another. And they were picked off much more often, because it was very hard for the moths that had that off color to hide. And when the surface that the moths liked to rest on was no longer available, but there was another surface where the moths that had a different color could safely rest, the ones that were dark started getting picked off in large numbers. Whereas the ones that had other colors where they could blend in with their environment were not often, or not as often, preyed on. And so over time, it switched from being mostly dark moths to mostly light moths. And in Chernobyl, something very similar to that happened. So there are several stories that I could tell, like how cancer caused by the Chernobyl disaster has ended up impacting the wolves. But there are some wolves who have genetic mutations that have allowed them to adapt to that radiation, while the wolves without that genetic variation are dying off. But what I want to show you is a much more graphical demonstration of, similar to the one I just related to you. So in this one, there's a common kind of frog in Europe. It's a green frog, and if you look around Europe in the areas where it naturally exists, you'll see that it's a nice kind of between medium and light green, and it has these stripes going from, you can kind of say it's kind of like going along the temples toward the eyes, but it's just a single black stripe. And so there was a team of scientists that noticed that near Chernobyl, there were a lot of these frogs that had darker coloration than the frogs outside of the disaster zone, where the radiation level can be said to be background radiation levels, which are considered to be normal, if you can consider radiation to be normal. Of that, I mean, that kind of radiation. There's radiation all over the world, especially because of countries using nuclear bombs in testing and in warfare, like America did, atomic bombs in that case. But so what they did is they looked at this particular species of frogs in several different areas, what they call control areas, where the frog exhibits the normal expected coloration, with the understanding that there are a small number comparatively of those frogs that have darker coloration. And then they moved closer and closer and closer to Chernobyl. And what they found was that as they got closer to Chernobyl, the number of darker frogs increased. And eventually the number of the lighter green frogs decreased. And in some of the most heavily irradiated areas, the frogs were almost black. And the reason for this is the melanin in the darker frogs has a greater chance of reflecting this invisible radiation from the nuclear plant, at Chernobyl, sorry. And so when you get close to Chernobyl, you see something like what I'm going to show you now. So as you can see on the far right, that color is the color you would most often encounter for this particular frog in nature, in areas outside of where the radiation is above normal. And as you move to the left toward that black one, or nearly black one, those are examples of the frogs you're most likely to encounter as you get closer and closer and closer to the disaster zone and then to the actual site of the disaster. So natural selection over time can take a species and cause little changes. Sometimes those little changes are isolated and they don't have an impact, and there's nothing further that gets changed. But sometimes there are incremental changes, one change after another change after another change. This can happen over many, many years, thousands of years, tens of thousands of years, hundreds of years, tens of years. It just depends on the species, how often they reproduce, what the factors are that are driving the changes, and so on. So in the case of positive or negative changes that happen often, that can have kind of like a chain of effects, so that after a certain amount of time, you look at that species and it's so different from the species that it started out as generations ago that it can no longer be considered the same species, because of so many different changes occurring for so many different reasons, or maybe a string of the same reasons over an extended period of time for that, again, for that species, depending on their reproduction rates and other factors. So another example could be you have an animal that is living in a meadow area, and it happens to be that that meadow borders a desert. And over time, this particular animal, and we'll just say a lizard, this particular animal becomes more and more comfortable with being closer to the desert. And so it's going to adapt to the needs of being in that area. Why would it want to go there? I don't know. Maybe there's a particular form of food it finds especially enjoyable. Maybe there are less predators over there. It could be that in the meadow, there are lots of predators eating the lizard, but when it gets too close to the desert, there aren't very many predators at all. There's so many different reasons that this can happen through natural selection and evolutionary genetic changes, or radiation changes, or whatever it happens to be. So how does this tie in with creationism? Well, there have been arguments going on for a very long time, ever since Darwin came up with the ideas of natural selection and evolution and stuff. And he took a really bad beating in terms of being ridiculed and stuff like that. But he still was willing to look at the arguments from people who didn't agree with him. And he learned from their arguments sometimes. He learned things that allowed him to refine his theory. Okay? And so while we don't have enough evidence to call it a law, or one step above that would be an axiom, we do have enough that suggests that we can't throw, scientists that is, can't throw away this theory, because there's too much evidence that points to the fact that it's either fully or partially right, but not enough evidence to elevate it to the status of a law or axiom. So But throughout history now, ever since that, and perhaps even before that was invented or discovered, I guess would be a better word, there has been a lot of arguments. There has been a lot of people saying, well, if you believe in creationism, you must be a fool because science, or you must be a fool if you believe in evolution because the Bible or the Quran or the Torah or whatever religious document is your religion, if you have one. So either side, they're like arguing as if these are two mutually exclusive things. I argue that they are not mutually exclusive. Now, to be clear, I am a deist, which means I don't believe in religion. I believe that religions were made by humans for better or for worse, for good reasons or for bad. I don't believe God had anything to do with them. Okay? So I reject those religions, although I believe that each religion has good things to teach us, as well as bad, like genocide. That's a bad thing. Now, the reason I say that they are not mutually exclusive and that they can exist at the same time, side by side, with no problem, at least at this point in time in our scientific understanding of the world, because religion doesn't really change much. I mean, yes, there are changes that occur, and that I would argue that some of those changes don't actually fit the religion, but that's a story for another time. Here's my thought on this. Evolution is the idea of changes that occur. Religion talks about the creation of the world and all the creatures by God or gods, depending on which religion you're talking about. Whether, for example, if you're a Hindu, if you believe the actual story of Hinduism, there's only one God. But if you believe the version of Hinduism that is it's a bastardization of Hinduism, then you believe in many gods, but they are below the level of the true gods. So it's like a multi-level thing. You have gods, you have demons, and then above all of them, you have the true gods that are actually the ones who are what you should worship, as opposed to these other gods and demons are people who have been either elevated and devolved depending on their behavior. But I digress. It's a long story. So let's focus on this. And I want you to think about this. If you don't believe in God, so be it. That's fine. But let's assume for a moment that God exists. And as is the assertion with many religions, God is in full control. God makes all the rules. And God made all the decisions and set everything in motion and lets it run. And in many religions, God will get involved. God will interfere for better or for worse. And in other religions, not so much. Like in Buddhism, they don't even know if there is a God exactly, but so it's more of a God perhaps that could just watch the experiment, or so to speak. Now, if a God has made the world, the universe, the animals, and everything else, God has set in place all of these rules for how everything works. Okay? Then clearly, one of the things that God created as a rule is evolution. Because there is evidence that that evolution is real. And if God is the one that set in motion all the laws of physics, the laws of math, the laws of science, then God created evolution. And I know this doesn't really help people who are atheists. Totally get it. But for those of you who are believers of some kind of a God or gods, this should make sense to you, unless your gods are weak gods, I guess you could say. Gods that don't have the power to set all the rules of the universe down and let them run. Off I've never really thought about this subject in relationship to atheists. So I really don't have anything prepared to explain why these are not mutually exclusive. So for an atheist, this video isn't really going to probably be of any use to you. But I hope that for everybody who's a theist, someone who believes in God or gods, that now you understand you don't have to argue about it anymore. It's not a conflict. Thanks for watching. I hope you have a great day.